I am not who you think I am. Those were Abdullah's last words to Neville Goddard before he vanished in 1936. For decades, people assumed he was being poetic, mystical, symbolic. But what if he was being literal? What if Abdullah wasn't what we think at all? Because the more you study the evidence, the less sense it makes. And the deeper you dig, the more disturbing the truth becomes. This isn't just a story about a teacher and a student. This is a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. Let's start with the facts that don't add up. Abdullah appeared in Harlem, New York, in the early 1920s. An old man, Ethiopian, deeply knowledgeable in Kabbalah and ancient mysticism. He taught Neville Goddard from 1931 to 1936. 5 years of intense, daily instruction. But here's where it gets strange. No one else from that era remembers him. Think about that for a moment. Harlem in the 1920s and 30s was a hub of spiritual movements. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just artistic, it was deeply mystical. There were metaphysical churches, occult societies, spiritualist gatherings happening everywhere. If Abdullah was a real, physical teacher operating in Harlem for over a decade, someone else should remember him, but they don't. No other students ever came forward. No photographs exist. No immigration records showing his entry into the United States. No birth certificate. No death certificate. No apartment lease. No utilities in his name. Nothing. It's as if Abdullah existed only for Neville, and Neville himself was strangely secretive about him. In his earliest lectures, from 1938 to 1948, Neville never mentioned Abdullah by name. For over 10 years, he taught the techniques publicly, but refused to reveal where he learned them. When students would ask, "Where did you learn this?" Neville would give vague answers. An old friend, a teacher in New York. Someone I studied with. Why the secrecy? It wasn't until 1948, 12 years after Abdullah disappeared, that Neville finally said the name publicly. And of Enton, he was careful, almost protective, as if revealing too much would somehow break something, or worse, make people doubt the entire teaching. So let's examine what Neville did say about Abdullah, and pay attention, because the details are stranger than you think. Neville said Abdullah could read minds, not metaphorically, not intuitively, literally read minds. Neville would arrive at Abdullah's apartment with a question, unspoken, just in his thoughts, and before Neville could say a word, Abdullah would answer it. Neville described one incident where he was walking up the stairs to Abdullah's apartment, thinking about a specific verse in the Bible. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone, hadn't written it down, just thinking about it. He knocked on the door. Abdullah opened it, looked at him, and immediately quoted the verse Neville had been thinking about, then said, "Now let me explain what it really means." How? Neville also said Abdullah knew things about his past that no one could have known. Private family matters, childhood memories, thoughts Neville had never spoken aloud to anyone. Abdullah would reference these things casually, as if he had been there, as if he had access to Neville's entire inner world. But perhaps the most unsettling thing Abdullah ever said to Neville was this: "I've been preparing for you for a very long time. Not, I've been teaching for a long time. Not, I've been waiting for a student like you. I have been preparing for you." As if Neville's arrival was not random. As if it was expected, planned, inevitable. As if Abdullah existed for this specific purpose. And then there's the final meeting. Neville described it in detail in a 1963 lecture. He said he went to Abdullah's apartment one day in 1936, and Abdullah looked different, calmer, almost translucent. Neville said. Abdullah told him, "You no longer need me. I am going away now." Neville asked where he was going. Abdullah smiled and said, "It doesn't matter where I'm going. What matters is what you now know." And then he said the words that haunt this entire mystery. "Remember this, Neville. I am not who you think I am. I am what you will become." And then he walked out the door. Neville never saw him again. No goodbyes. No forwarding address. No trace. Gone. So what was Abdullah? Over the years, researchers and students have developed three main theories. Let's examine each one. Theory 1. Abdullah was a physical man, the conventional explanation. An Ethiopian Jew, possibly from the Beta Israela community, an ancient Jewish population in Ethiopia with roots going back thousands of years. These communities practiced a unique form of Judaism, mixed with Kabbalistic mysticism. According to this theory, Abdullah emigrated to the United States sometime in the 1910s or early 1920s. He settled in Harlem, taught Kabbalah privately, met Neville, trained him for 5 years. Then returned to Ethiopia sometime before the Italian invasion of 1935. This theory makes sense on the surface. It explains his knowledge of Kabbalah, his Ethiopian background, his presence in Harlem. But it doesn't explain the lack of records. Even in the 1920s, immigration left paper trails. People had addresses, landlords, neighbors who remembered them. And it doesn't explain the mind reading, or how Abdullah seemed to know things about Neville's life that no physical person could have known, or why he said, "I am not who you think I am," unless he was lying or being poetic. But Neville didn't think he was being poetic. Neville took those words literally. Which brings us to Theory 2. Theory 2. Abdullah was a Tulpa, a thought form. This theory is more controversial, but hear me out. In Tibetan Buddhism, advanced practitioners are said to be able to create Tulpa. A Tulpa is a being manifested from pure consciousness. It starts as a thought, an imagination, a focused intention, but with enough concentration and belief, it becomes semi-autonomous. It takes on a life of its own. Some Tulpas are said to become so real that other people can see them, interact with them, even touch them. Now imagine this. Neville, in 1931, was desperate. He was a struggling dancer in New York, fascinated by mysticism, but with no real teacher. He was reading books on metaphysics, experimenting with techniques, searching for answers. He needed a master, a guide, someone who could teach him what he was trying to learn. What if that desperate need created Abdullah? What if Neville's consciousness, unknowingly, unconsciously, manifested a teacher, not a hallucination, not an imaginary friend? Tulpa, a thought form, a being created from pure assumption and belief. This would explain everything. Why there are no records? Because Abdullah never physically Why no one else remembers him? Because he existed primarily for Neville. Why Abdullah could read Neville's mind? Because Abdullah was Neville's mind, externalized, and it would explain Abdullah's final words. "I am not who you think I am. I am what you will become." Because Abdullah wasn't a separate entity, teacher Neville. Abdullah was Neville. The future version, the awakened version, the fully realized consciousness. Neville's higher self externalized into a teacher. And when Neville finally understood the technique, when he became what Abdullah represented, Abdullah was no longer needed. So he dissolved back into the consciousness that created him. But there's a third theory, and it's the strangest of all. Theory 3. Abdullah was something else entirely. What if Abdullah was neither fully physical nor fully imagined? What if he existed in the liminal space that Neville would later spend his entire life describing? The space between waking and sleeping. The space between imagination and reality. The space where assumption becomes fact. Neville taught that imagination is reality, that the inner world and the outer world are not separate. They're the same thing viewed from different angles. He taught that consciousness can assume a state, and that state hardens into fact. What if Abdullah was a living demonstration of that principle? What if he was both real and imagined? Both a man from Ethiopia and a projection of Neville's consciousness. Both teacher and student, simultaneously. What if Abdullah existed in that quantum space where all possibilities collapse into one reality based on observation and assumption? In quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states at once, until observed. What if consciousness works the same way? What if Abdullah was in superposition, both real and unreal, until Neville's observation and belief collapsed him into a singular, tangible teacher? And when Neville no longer needed that particular collapsed state, Abdullah returned to superposition, to potentiality, to the void of infinite possibility. This theory suggests that Abdullah was the ultimate proof of the law of assumption, not just a teacher of the law, but a manifestation by the law. Here's what we know for certain. Before Abdullah, Neville Goddard was a struggling dancer with vague spiritual interests. After Abdullah, Neville became one of the most powerful teachers of consciousness in the 20th century. The transformation was total. The technique Abdullah taught him, living in the end, assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, sleeping in the state of the answered prayer, became the foundation of everything Neville would teach for the next 36 years. Every lecture, every book, every technique, all of it came from those 5 years with Abdullah. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. Neville never claimed to have invented this technique. He always credited Abdullah, and yet there's no record of Abdullah teaching anyone else. No other lineage, no other students, no books written by Abdullah, no lectures given by Abdullah. It's as if the entire technique was delivered to Neville, and Neville alone. Delivered by a being who appeared, taught, and vanished. A being who left no trace. A being who said, "I am not who you think I am." Now, you might say, this is all speculation. We don't have proof. And you're right. We don't have proof. But we do have Neville's testimony. And Neville was not a liar. He was not delusional. He was a careful, precise teacher who spent decades helping people transform their lives using the exact technique Abdullah taught him. And the technique works. Thousands of people, millions now, have used Neville's teachings to manifest specific, tangible results, which raises the ultimate question. Does it matter whether Abdullah was real in the conventional sense? If the teaching works, if people's lives are changed, if consciousness truly can assume a state and manifest it into reality, then maybe Abdullah is proof of his own teaching. Maybe Abdullah was Neville's first successful manifestation, the ultimate demonstration that assumption creates reality. So, what does all of this mean? Let me offer you a perspective that might tie everything together. Perhaps Abdullah, whether man, manifestation, tulpa, or mystery, represents something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps he represents the principle that reality is not fixed, that the boundary between inner and outer, between imagined and real, between subject and object, is thinner than we think, maybe even non-existent. Neville spent his entire teaching career saying the same thing over and over. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Live in the end. Sleep in the state of your answered prayer. He wasn't teaching visualization. He wasn't teaching positive thinking. He was teaching assumption as reality. The idea that if you assume something deeply enough, consistently enough, with feeling, it must manifest. Not because you're attracting it, not because you're asking the universe for it, but because assumption is creation. Consciousness, assuming a state, is that state coming into being. And if that's true for your desires, your goals, your circumstances, why couldn't it be true for a teacher? If Neville desperately needed a master, if he assumed with all his being that such a teacher existed and was waiting for him, then by the very law Abdullah taught him, Abdullah had to appear. Not as magic, not as coincidence, but as the inevitable result of assumption hardening into fact. And when the assumption changed, when Neville became the master himself, Abdullah was no longer needed. The assumption dissolved, and so did Abdullah. I am not who you think I am. I am what you will become. Maybe Abdullah was speaking the literal truth. He wasn't a separate entity. He was Neville's own awakened consciousness, temporarily externalized to teach Neville what he needed to learn. And when Neville learned it, when Neville became it, there was no more separation, no more teacher and student, just consciousness recognizing itself. Was Abdullah real? I think the answer is yes, but not in the way we usually mean real. Abdullah was real in the way all of reality is real, as a projection of consciousness, assuming a state. He was as real as anything else you've ever experienced. As real as this video you're watching right now, as real as the life you're living. Because all of it, every person, every circumstance, every experience, Is consciousness assuming states and experiencing them as reality. Abdullah proved that he didn't just teach the law. He was the law, a living demonstration that consciousness is the only reality. And that's why his story matters. Not because we need to solve the mystery of whether he was a man or a manifestation, but because his very existence, however you explain it, proves that reality is far more flexible than we've been taught to believe. Next time, we're going deeper. We're going to explore the specific technique Abdullah used, the method Neville called the most important thing I ever learned, the practice that changed everything. Subscribe now, because if Abdullah could appear from pure consciousness, what else can you create?